You've probably looked at Caelid's giant dogs and crows and thought the same thing I did. Scarlet Rot made them. The entire region looks infected. The creatures look mutated. Everything about Caelid screams biological disaster. And the game practically wants us to connect those giant dogs and crows to Malenia's Scarlet Bloom. But I think that is one of the biggest misdirections in Elden Ring. Because the more I looked at where these creatures actually appear, the less convinced I became that Scarlet Rot created them. In fact, I think the opposite is true. I don't think Caelid created these monsters at all. I think Caelid simply revealed them. And the giant dogs and crows aren't the result of a recent catastrophe. They're just an evidence of something much older hiding beneath the history of the lands between. At first glance, the Scarlet Rot theory feels impossible to argue against. You enter Caelid and immediately see a landscape that has been completely transformed. The earth is dying, the wildlife is twisted, the sky itself looks diseased. And right there, among the rot, are giant crows and massive dog-like creatures that look more like dinosaurs than animals. Naturally, the conclusion seems obvious. Rot causes mutation, mutation creates monsters. Case closed. The problem is that Elden Ring refuses to keep these creatures inside Caelid. The giant dogs appear in the mountaintops of the giants. The giant crows appear in multiple locations outside the region. That completely changes the conversation, because once these creatures exist somewhere else, Caelid stops being an explanation. It becomes a clue. The moment I noticed that, the next question appeared. Why do they keep appearing in the same kinds of places? That question leads somewhere much more interesting, because these creatures don't seem connected by Scarlet Rot. They seem connected by something else entirely. It is a death. The moment I started looking at their locations instead of their appearance, a pattern emerged. Not every place has Scarlet Rot, but every place has bodies. Caelid is one of the largest graveyards in the lands between. The battle between Radahn and Malenia left countless dead behind. Dragons littered the landscape, soldiers continue fighting long after death. The region is practically built on corpses. Then there is the Mountaintops of the Giants, another battlefield, another place defined by the ancient slaughter, another place where enormous numbers of bodies are accumulated. And then we have Mohgwyn Palace, a palace built on sacrifice, blood and death. Again, the same creatures appear, different regions, different histories, different powers, same monsters. At that point, Scarlet Rot starts looking less like the cause and more like the coincidence. What these locations share isn't infection, it's food. The giant crows are scavengers. The giant dogs behave like scavengers. Everywhere they appear, there are a lot of corpses and remnants of war. And suddenly the mystery begins to look completely different. Maybe these creatures aren't products of catastrophe. Maybe they are creatures that thrive because of catastrophe. And if they are feeding on the aftermath of these events rather than being created by them, then we need to start thinking about what exactly they are consuming. And that is where Elden Ring's lore gets really interesting. One of the most fascinating ideas in Elden Ring is that consuming something powerful can fundamentally change what you are. Dragon Communion is an obvious example. Consume enough dragon hearts and that transformation begins. Power passes through consumption. Identity changes through consumption. The act of eating is never just biological in the lands between. It's spiritual, magical and dangerous. Now look again at the giant dogs and crows. What if they aren't simply feeding on ordinary corpses? What if they are feeding on creatures infused with runes? Dragons, giants, ancient warriors, demigod armies, the most powerful beings in the world, tend to leave behind equally powerful remains. And the places where giant dogs and crows appear are exactly the places where those remains accumulate. Caelid is filled with dragon corpses. The mountaintops contain the remains of giants and ancient wars. Mohgwyn Palace contains mountains of sacrificed victims. What if these creatures became monstrous not because they were infected, but because they spent generations consuming concentrated power? Suddenly their size makes sense, distribution makes sense, their overall existence in multiple regions makes sense. The common factor isn't Scarlet Rot, the common factor is abundance, an abundance of death, flesh, of power left behind by death. And that leads to even bigger problem to the mutation theory, because if Scarlet Rot created these creatures, then the mountaintops shouldn't exist. The strongest evidence against the Scarlet Rot explanation isn't found in Caelid, it's found far away from it. The mountaintops of giants create a contradiction that mutation theory struggles to solve. The giant dogs are there, the giant crowns are there, they don't look like different species, they don't look like the distant relatives. They look like the same creatures that forces a difficult question. How can Scarlet Rot create monsters in a place that was never transformed by Malenia's bloom? There are attempts to explain it. Some theories suggest that Scarlet Rot existed in the Mountaintops long before the events of the game. And to be fair, there are evidence that the Outer God of Rot is far older than Malenia. But even if we accept that possibility, another issue remains. Most creatures connected to Scarlet Rot actually displayed signs of the Scarlet Rot. They spread it, inflict it, they visibly embody it. The giant dogs and crows don't. That is what always bothered me. They are constantly cited as examples of Rot mutation, yet they lack the characteristics normally associated with Rot-afflicted life. Instead, they feel strangely natural, terrifying ancient but natural, like predators perfectly adapted to their environment, not victims of it. And once that possibility enters the picture, another connection starts becoming impossible to ignore. The connection between these creatures and some of the oldest remnants in the game. There is one detail that kept pulling me back: the giant skeletons. Some of the largest skeletal remains in the Elden Ring appear in two places, Caelid and the Mountaintops. The same two regions where giant dogs and crows appear most prominently. That doesn't feel accidental. These skeletons are impossible to miss. They dominate entire landscapes. Yet the game never fully explains them. And that silence feels intentional. Because Elden Ring loves telling stories through placement. Not exposition, not dialogue, but placement. When the same creatures repeatedly appear next to evidence of a forgotten age, it's hard not to wonder whether they are connected. What if the giant dogs and crows aren't examples of life becoming corrupted? What if they're examples of life that never changed? What if they're survivors? Remnants of an older world where larger creatures were normal. A world that existed before the current order, before the Earth Tree, before the history we spent the game exploring. And suddenly their presence in multiple regions becomes easier to understand. They are not tied to a specific disaster, they are tied to a much older ecosystem, one that never completely disappeared. And that actually changed how I look at Caelid. Because the real horror isn't that Scarlet Rot created the creatures, it's that Scarlet Rot didn't need to. The deeper I looked into this mystery, the less important Scarlet Rot became. Not because Scarlet Rot is irrelevant, not because it may have distracted us from the real story. Scarlet Rot absolutely transformed Caelid. It reshaped the ecosystem, it rewarded scavengers, it created the environment where creatures that feed on death could thrive. But thriving is not the same thing as originating. And that is the distinction that changed everything for me. I don't think the giant dogs and crows were born from the Scarlet Bloom. I think they were already waiting. Waiting in battlefields, graveyards, in places where enough death accumulated to sustain them. Caelid didn't create them, Caelid fed them. And once I started looking at them through this lens, they stopped feeling like mutants. They started feeling like something far more unsettling. They started feeling like a species perfectly adapted to the darkest moments in the history. A species that appear whenever civilization collapses, that thrives when countless dead are left behind. Which means the real mystery isn't why they exist in Caelid. The real mystery is how many times they've appeared throughout the history of the lands between. Because if these creatures are older than the Scarlet Bloom, then every battlefield in Elden Ring may be telling the same story. Not the story of monsters created by disaster, but the story of predators that have always followed it. Thanks for watching, hit that like button and subscribe for more Elden Ring and other Souls-like games lore and guide videos, and stay sharp out there, Tarnished.